Picture this. You're walking through the streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD, and you witness something that makes your blood run cold. The emperor himself, Nero, is strolling through the forum with what appears to be his new wife, a stunning young woman draped in silken jewels. But whispers follow in their wake, because everyone knows the horrifying truth. That woman beside the most powerful man in the world was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him represents one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical abuse in recorded history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the story of how absolute power can transform love into obsession, grief into madness, and a human being into a living doll created to serve one man's twisted fantasy. The name Sporus might not be familiar to you, but his story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of this tragedy. Nero wasn't born evil. In fact, his early reign showed remarkable promise. When he ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, many Romans believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He reduced taxes, funded public entertainment, and even performed in theatrical productions that delighted the common people. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls. And by 65 AD, something had fundamentally broken inside the emperor's mind. Maybe it was the constant paranoia that comes with knowing everyone around you wants your position. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, never be told they were wrong. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Nero thought he wanted in a woman. Beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to match his own grandiose vision of himself, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just another pretty face in the imperial court. She possessed the kind of sharp political instincts that made her a formidable ally or a dangerous enemy. When Nero first laid eyes on Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. It had been a cold, loveless political marriage. Poppaea represented everything that Octavia was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Poppaea was vivacious and commanding. Where Octavia sought to avoid attention, Poppaea reveled in being the center of everyone's gaze. The affair between Nero and Poppaea began as a typical Roman scandal, but what started as adultery quickly evolved into something much more dangerous, genuine obsession. Nero wasn't just attracted to Poppaea's beauty. He was consumed by her in a way that terrified even his closest advisors. Ancient historians describe Nero's behavior during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would fly into murderous rages if other men so much as looked at Poppaea too long during public functions. He began stationing guards around her at all times, ostensibly for protection, but really to monitor her every interaction. He lavished her with gifts that bankrupted the imperial treasury: jewels from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia. But perhaps most tellingly, he began to reshape reality itself to accommodate his obsession. First, he divorced Octavia, a shocking move that alienated many supporters. Then, he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a full imperial ceremony. The wedding was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury, with Nero sparing no expense to demonstrate his devotion. Even marriage couldn't satisfy Nero Unc's need to possess Pia completely. He began to isolate her from family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed their positions entirely to his favor. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her, not just for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could look upon her image even when they were apart. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would sometimes spend hours simply watching Pia as she went about her daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion. It was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership, who saw another human being not as an independent person, but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Pia, for her part, seemed to understand the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero Unc's obsession gave her unprecedented power, but also shrewd enough to realize this power came with enormous risk. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests, building a network of supporters who would protect her if Nero Unc's affections ever wavered. But Poppaea had one fatal flaw. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court who had learned to anticipate the emperor's moods, Poppaea retained her independence of spirit. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his performances when she thought they were subpar. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary depending on which ancient historian you believe, but the outcome was always the same. During what started as a typical domestic argument, some sources say about Nero coming home late from chariot races, others about his theatrical pursuits. The emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him forever. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero Unc's priorities, suggesting he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband and father. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps the stress made her less willing to tolerate Nero Unc's increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but the consensus is that Nero, in a fit of rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources suggest it was a single blow to her abdomen. Others describe a sustained attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor. Imagine the moment when Nero realized what he had done. The man who commanded 30 legions, who could have anyone executed with a word, who was worshipped as a god in eastern provinces, had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The woman he had obsessed over was dying because of his own uncontrolled violence. Ancient sources described the scene that followed as one of the most pathetic in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself on Poppaea's body, alternately begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned the best physicians in Rome, offering them fortunes to save her life, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Pia died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Nero Unc's heir. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. The grief that followed wasn't just emotional devastation. It was a complete break with reality. Nero Unc's mourning became legendary. He refused to have property as body burned according to Roman custom, instead having it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her divine, established a cult in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had to navigate an even more treacherous landscape. Courtiers were expected to participate in the fiction that Poppaea was somehow still alive, referring to her in present tense and leaving her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested the emperor should move on was immediately exiled or worse. It was during this period that Sporus first entered Nero's line of sight, though the young man had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. Sporus was probably around 14 or 15, born into slavery in the imperial household and freed as a child. He had been raised within the palace walls, receiving education that prepared him for administrative duties. This was actually a position of relative privilege. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better conditions than freeborn citizens of lower classes, but this privilege came with complete dependence on imperial favor. Freedmen owed everything to their former master's generosity, creating absolute vulnerability. They could be elevated to great influence, but also discarded, punished, or killed on a whim with no legal recourse. What made Sporus special in Nero's eyes wasn't his intelligence or skills, it was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where Romans believed physical resemblance indicated deeper spiritual connection, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the Emperor's broken mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment Nero may have actually believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one obvious problem. Sporus was male, but for a man who had convinced himself he was a god, who had spent months talking to a corpse, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in human history. Nero didn't just decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman. He decided to make the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned the best physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man purely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation. It was systematic destruction of Sporus' identity as a human being. The procedure was dangerous, painful, and irreversible, often resulting in death from infection or blood loss. But even if Sporus survived, he would be forever changed physically, emotionally, and socially. He would never father children, never experience normal relationships, never even be considered fully male by Roman society. The surgery took place in the imperial palace, in quarters specifically prepared for the purpose. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive, relying on basic instruments and crude anesthetics. The process would have been excruciating, lasting hours with significant risk of death. Sporus would have been held down by guards while physicians approached with their instruments, knowing his screams would fall on deaf ears. Once Sporus recovered, a process taking weeks or months, Nero announced something that shocked even jaded Roman aristocrats. He was going to marry the young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony. The preparations took months and consumed enormous resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to special quarters where he could be prepared for his new role. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe, designing gowns that would flatter his modified physique and hide remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't just accessories, they were tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace. Makeup artists taught him cosmetic techniques to feminize his features. They showed him how to use kohl to make his eyes appear larger, how to apply rouge for rosy cheeks, how to use powders to soften facial angles. These lessons weren't just about appearance. They were exercises in systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers instructed him in elaborate styling techniques, fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was cut, curled, and arranged in complex patterns, often incorporating expensive ornaments. The process could take hours daily, requiring multiple servants and heated metal tools, but perhaps most psychologically damaging were lessons in feminine behavior and deportment. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in appropriately ladylike ways. He learned how to hold his hands, position his feet, arrange his clothing when seated, and move through space, conveying grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt linguistic mannerisms associated with feminine discourse. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained and difficult to change consciously. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this transformation? Every day, Sporus was forced to look in mirrors, reflecting back a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior reminded him that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman was now a shackle binding him to a role he never chose. The wedding was scheduled for spring 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight. Nero spared no expense, treating it as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants offered finest wines and delicacies. To outside observers who didn't know the full story, it might have looked like a normal imperial wedding. But those in the know understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and disturbing. Here was the most powerful man in the world, publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy dressed as his dead wife. The ceremony included all traditional Roman rituals, exchanging vows, joining hands, sharing sacred bread, signing legal documents, making this union official. The guests played their parts with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations and expensive gifts while maintaining appropriate joy. But the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror, fascination, and nervous energy that comes from participating in something fundamentally wrong. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would a legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, quarters within the palace complex, and income from the imperial treasury. He had his own litter for traveling, horses for riding, and retinue of supporters. But all this apparent luxury came with a terrible price: complete erasure of his original identity and constant performance of a psychologically devastating role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit beside him at state dinners, and play the devoted wife in all interactions. This wasn't just about appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully resurrected Poppaea. He would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never happened, and expect responses maintaining the elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest mistake could mean death. He had to remember not just how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were popular herself. When Nero mentioned events from his previous marriage, Sporus had to react as if he remembered them personally. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero-Unc's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as time passed, though he continued playing his assigned role perfectly in public. The psychological strain is almost impossible to imagine. Every morning, Sporus woke in rooms decorated to remind him of a dead woman he'd never met. Every mirror reflection bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required pretending to be someone else, having memories and experiences that weren't his own. For over 2 years, Sporus lived this bizarre existence, but his ordeal reached new heights when Nero decided to tour Greece. The emperor fancied himself an artist and was eager to compete in Greek festivals where he believed his talents would be properly appreciated. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him, displayed to foreign dignitaries as the Empress of Rome. Imagine Greek aristocrats trying to make sense of their conqueror, traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, demanding everyone treat this obvious fiction as reality. But by 68 AD, Nero's successes had finally pushed the Roman establishment too far. Rebellions broke out across the empire, led by governors tired of the emperor's erratic behavior and neglect of governance. The Taurian Guard declared opposition to Nero's continued rule, and the Senate condemned him as an enemy of the state. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of supporters, Sporus was among them. Even facing death, the emperor couldn't leave behind his living reminder of Poppaea. They holed up in a villa outside Rome, waiting for either rescue or capture, while Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical preparations for suicide. When word came that enemies were closing in, Nero finally chose death over capture, but his suicide left Sporus incredibly vulnerable as one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign. He was both a valuable prize and dangerous liability for whoever claimed power next. What followed was perhaps even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn passed from one powerful man to another like valuable property. First claimed by Nitius Sabinus, then by then by Vitellius, each treating him much as Nero had, keeping him dressed as a woman and calling him by Pia's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus' nightmare reached its ultimate conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in a reenactment of mythological scenes involving violence and humiliation. For Sporus, this represented the ultimate degradation, being sexually humiliated in front of thousands for their amusement. Rather than submit to this final humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his own in years. He took his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his life. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. But ancient historians seemed less interested in Sporus as a person than as a symbol of imperial decadence. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the abuse he endured, but how he was systematically stripped of identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became instead a canvas for the emperor's twisted fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that somewhere beneath the layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self best survived. His suicide was both tragedy and final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? What did he want to do with his life? All of that was erased when he became Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance so complete that his original identity disappeared entirely. The boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of psychological and physical abuse, who finally chose death over further degradation. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. In choosing his own death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied him throughout his adult life: the power to make his own choice about his fate. His story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and our compassion, even across the vast gulf of 2,000 years.